breathe deep the air of the ultimate sanctum. It tastes of copper, despair, and pulverized bone. Beneath the cavernous vaults of the Imperial Palace on Terra, the atmosphere is thick with the sharp tang of ozone, the sickening stench of burning blood, and the ceaseless grinding of ancient, dying circuitry. Here, at the center of a million worlds, sits the master of mankind. He is no radiant savior of light. He is a rotting carcass, a shattered husk of a man fused in endless waking agony to the grotesque machinery of the Golden Throne. This sputtering, failing engine of life support is the only thing tethering his immense soul to the material realm. It is a ravenous, unforgiving machine. Every single day, the silent fleets of the black ships deliver their grim tithe. 1,000 living psychers are chained and fed directly into the psychic furnace of the throne. Their minds scream into the void as their life force is brutally vaporized, burned away in a single day just to sustain the Emperor's decaying vessel, while a separate choir fuels the Astronomicon. This is not a kingdom of salvation. It is an empire sustained by desperate, eternal cannibalism. Yet across the sprawling expanse of the Imperium, untold trillions fall to their knees in ignorant, fervent worship. They pray to a golden idol, envisioning a benevolent deity of endless mercy and righteous wrath. They build colossal cathedrals that reach into the polluted, choked skies of hive worlds, suffocating the stars with the smoke of sacred incense and the endless drone of hymns. They cry out for deliverance to a God who cannot hear them over the deafening eternal roar of his own perpetual torment. The High Lords of Terra rule this sprawling, decaying empire in his name. They are blind stewards leading a blind species through an era of unmatched, suffocating darkness. This is the greatest and most terrible lie of our age. The master of mankind never sought to be a god of worship. He despised the blind faith of religion, viewing it as the chain that kept humanity bound to the mud and vulnerable to the laughing predators of the warp. He did not intend to build a church or author a sacred text. He was constructing an engine of true physical and psychic ascension for the entire human species. He sought to elevate mankind to a state of absolute mastery, guiding us safely into our evolutionary destiny beyond the need for gods entirely. Consider the crushing, agonizing irony of the 41st millennium. The current state of the Imperium is the exact, twisted nightmare he sacrificed everything to prevent. He fought to eradicate superstition, yet he is now the supreme deity of the most fanatical, ignorant theocracy in galactic history. He sought to starve the dark powers of the warp by removing emotion and faith, yet his sprawling empire feeds those very demons with endless war, misery and fanaticism. He is imprisoned by the very faith he tried to destroy, locked in a decaying shell, while his great dream turns to ash around him. To understand the magnitude of this cosmic tragedy, we must look backward through the mists of time. We must strip away 10,000 years of dogma, incense and ecclesiastical lies. We must descend past the myth of the rotting god-emperor upon his throne of gold. We must seek the mortal flesh that walked the earth in the forgotten, blood-soaked ages of human antiquity. Before the devastating betrayal of his sons, before the grand ambition of the Great Crusade, and before the silence of the throne, there was simply a man standing in the shadows of prehistory. To understand the decaying sovereign upon the Golden Throne, we must cast our sight back through the mists of antiquity. Long before the age of rust and ruin, before the very concept of the Imperium was conceived, ancient Terra was a cradle of raw, untamed mysticism. In the primitive region known to unrecorded history as Anatolia, the ultimate anchor for humanity's future in a wider, darker cosmos was forged. During this forgotten epoch, the earth was guided by a conclave of shamanic seers. These ancient psychers possessed a deep, harmonious connection to the immaterium, a realm that was then a placid ocean of energy. When these shamans perished, their souls did not dissipate. They drifted peacefully through the ether to be born anew in flesh, guiding primitive humanity across countless generations. But the tranquility of the unseen realm was destined to shatter. As human populations grew, bringing with them a surge of complex emotions, ambition, and cruelty, the warp began to curdle. Malignant currents formed within the once peaceful sea. The shamans, returning to the ethereal tide after death, found themselves hunted. Predatory entities, coalescing from the darkest reflections of mortal minds, began to devour the migrating souls of the seers. The cycle of reincarnation was broken. Faced with the utter annihilation of their kind and the eventual doom of all humanity, the shamans gathered in a final, desperate conclave. They saw the encroaching nightmare of chaos and understood that individually they were nothing but prey. In an act of supreme, unparalleled sacrifice, thousands of the greatest minds of Terra consumed lethal poisons. They committed mass suicide, releasing their souls simultaneously into the immaterium. Instead of drifting apart, this immense tide of psychic energy rushed together, weaving into a singular, blinding beacon of power that bypassed the waiting jaws of the warp predators. This unified essence anchored itself to a perfectly resonant biological vessel, gestating in a humble Anatolian village. From this union of flesh and 1,000 souls, a child was born, one who would later walk the ancient earth under the name Neoth. It is vital to comprehend the fundamental nature of his existence. He is not a divine entity birthed by the madness of the warp. He is a gestalt human weapon, deliberately forged in the crucible of mass sacrifice to stand as the ultimate bulwark against the darkness. Every cell in his biological form hums with the combined memories, foresight, and unyielding defiance of the ancient shamans. This singular origin established his eternal, uncompromising hostility toward chaos. He was created to be the bane of the dark gods, a living engine of order meant to burn away the unnatural filth of the immaterium. For thousands of years, the immortal Neoth walked the infant earth in secret. He watched empires rise from the dust and crumble into ashes, bearing the crushing weight of 1,000 lifetimes within his singular mind. Yet as he wandered the primitive world, guided by the whispering echoes of his creators, he realized a profound truth. Despite his staggering power and his lonely burden of immortality, he did not walk the ancient paths of Terra entirely alone. Before the ascendance of the Golden Throne, the Master of Mankind did not walk the long millennia alone. He was one of a rare breed, a divergent strain of humanity known as the Perpetuals. These were natural mutants, born with the uncanny gift of true biological immortality. They could be brutally wounded, their physical forms utterly destroyed, yet their flesh would always knit together, drawing them back from the abyss of death, unless struck by the most esoteric of weapons. In the shadow of forgotten empires, the Emperor gathered these immortal kindred to his side. They were a secret cabal of eternal watchers, guiding the fragile destiny of a young species. Among them stood figures of profound antiquity and power. There was Ullanor's person, a soldier who had bled in the forgotten primordial wars of old Earth. There was Erda, a geneticist of unparalleled genius and a mother to the future. And there was Malcador, the Sigillite, an enigmatic scholar of forbidden lore. In those ancient epochs, the Emperor was not yet a tyrant. He was a consensus builder, a king among equals who sought the counsel of his ageless peers. Together, this Circle of Perpetuals orchestrated the rise and fall of civilizations, steering humanity away from the brink of absolute ruin. They believed they had all the time in the universe to perfect their grand design. But the Emperor possessed a vision that pierced the veil of tomorrow, and what he saw shattered their eternal patience. His foresight revealed a dark and inevitable truth. Humanity was evolving into a psychic race, destined to awaken into a galaxy infested by the predatory horrors of the warp. If left to develop at its natural pace, this psychic metamorphosis would end in apocalyptic ruin, consuming the species in a firestorm of demonic madness. To save mankind, the Emperor deduced that he must seize absolute control of its destiny. The luxury of consensus was dead, replaced by the cold calculus of survival. His methods grew increasingly cruel, uncompromising, and tyrannical. He demanded unquestioning obedience to his vision, adopting a philosophy where the most monstrous atrocities were justified if they preserved the species. The noble brotherhood of immortals began to fracture under the weight of this totalitarian shift. The Perpetuals looked upon the being they had called a friend, and saw only a ruthless warlord willing to sacrifice oceans of blood for his ultimate goal. Terrified by his megalomania, they abandoned him one by one. Ullanor walked away, choosing the quiet obscurity of a humble life over the bloody crusades of an autocrat. Erda recoiled from the horrific truth of his genetic ambitions, taking her leave in sorrow and disgust. Soon, only the loyal Malcador remained by his side. The Emperor was left profoundly isolated, surrounded only by the echoes of his own absolute authority. He stood alone at the summit of human history, a solitary god in waiting, bearing the impossible burden of an entire species. Yet even he knew that the task ahead was too vast for any natural being to achieve. He realized that the fractured loyalty of his immortal peers and the fragile strength of mortal armies would never be enough to conquer the stars. To enforce his supreme vision, he would need weapons born of a fundamentally different nature, driving him to look beyond the boundaries of reality and seek a power forbidden to all. Abandoned by his immortal kin, the master of mankind was left to face the encroaching darkness alone. He understood a fundamental truth that the others refused to accept. The warp was a well of infinite madness, and any psychic sorcery drawn from its depths would inevitably corrupt the soul. He needed a weapon to forge humanity's ascension, but one that was completely divorced from the treacherous currents of the immaterium. His desperate search for a pure, untainted mechanism of control led him into the deepest antiquities of human myth. He sought the primal syntax of creation itself. He sought Enuncia. Enuncia was not a language meant to be spoken by mortal tongues. It was the underlying code of the physical universe, a lexicon of syllables that commanded reality to reshape itself. To speak a word of Enuncia was to rewrite the fundamental laws of mass, energy, and existence without ever channeling a single drop of psychic power. It was a violently physical force that tore the throats of those who dared to whisper it, breaking bone and rupturing air with the sheer weight of its impossible phonetics. Yet the Emperor saw it as the ultimate salvation. If he could master this Enuncia, he could sculpt a perfect ordered galaxy without risking the predatory gaze of the ruinous powers. To this end, he gathered the scattered fragments of the primal vocabulary and constructed a grand edifice to harness its world-breaking resonance. This monument of supreme ambition would be remembered in the ashes of history as the Tower of Babel. It was here that the Emperor's grand design met its most devastating reckoning. Ullanor person, the oldest of the Perpetuals and once a trusted comrade, saw only staggering hubris in the Emperor's endeavor. Ullanor knew that Enuncia was far too dangerous and volatile for any single being to wield, even one as mighty as the master of mankind. He recognized that the Emperor's obsessive desire for absolute control had blinded him to the apocalyptic risks of consolidating the lexicon into a single devastating weapon. In the shadow of the Great Tower, mortal and immortal wills collided in bitter defiance. Ullanor struck against his former friend, choosing to destroy the repository of the Enuncia rather than let it be used to enslave reality. The confrontation shattered the immense structure. Babel fell in a cataclysm of unbound physical law, burying the lexicon beneath thousands of tons of ruined stone and scattering the syllables of creation to the winds. The destruction of the tower was a bitter defeat that echoed through the millennia. The Emperor stood amid the rubble of his greatest earthly ambition and realized a terrible, inescapable truth. The physical universe alone did not contain the power necessary to secure the survival of the human species. His desperate hope of bypassing the immaterium had crumbled into dust at his feet. If he could not command reality from the safety of the material realm, he would have no choice but to steal the fire of the gods. He would have to master the very corruption he had sought to avoid. His gaze lifted from the ruined earth of ancient Terra and fixed upon the cold, distant stars. The path to absolute power now lay beyond the veil of reality, waiting in the darkest, most unfathomable depths of the warp. Denied the absolute control of the unmaking language, the master of mankind turned his gaze toward the tempest. If the material universe could not yield the power required to save humanity, he would take it from the great ocean. During the waning epochs of the dark age of technology, he voyaged across the starlit void in a vessel of archaic design. His destination was Molech. Though it would eventually regress into a primitive sphere of sprawling forests and feudal night houses, in that ancient epoch it was a highly advanced nexus of human interstellar supremacy. To the Emperor, it was the focal point of the cosmos. Hidden deep beneath the soil of Molech was a singular anomaly. It was a dormant warp gate of impossible geometry, a direct threshold into the deepest depths of the immaterium. The Emperor did not merely observe the tides of the warp from the safety of real space, he walked into the abyss. He stepped willingly into the realm of chaos. There, amidst the screaming madness of the immaterial plane, the Emperor stood before the ruinous powers. He faced the four great sentiences of the warp. What transpired within that realm of unreason remains the ultimate secret of the Imperial truth, obscured by millennia of blood and dogma. It is widely whispered to have been a Faustian bargain. Yet it is far more accurate to say that the master of mankind played the thief, stealing the primordial fire of the gods themselves. When he eventually stepped back onto the soil of Molech, he was irrevocably changed. He had entered the gate as a peerless immortal, but he emerged as a being of terrifying, blinding majesty. He was now supercharged with stolen essence, radiating a psychic corona that could burn away the minds of mortals. Most importantly, he had obtained the raw, conceptual power required to manipulate warp stuff with absolute mastery, granting him the divine ability to forge souls. But the nature of this theft demands a terrifying pause. We are forced to question the terms of that dark negotiation. One must ask if the Emperor promised the Pantheon the very souls of humanity in exchange for the power to unite the stars. We must wonder if he offered up the collective spirit of our species only to break his oath and renege on the deal the moment he held the fire. It is a chilling contemplation. This single act of cosmic deceit is the true inciting incident of the eternal war. The Emperor robbed the primordial annihilator, leaving the Chaos Gods deceived, humiliated, and burning with a wrath that would eventually consume the galaxy. They instantly began weaving their long, intricate webs of revenge against the one they now called the Anathema. Yet the Emperor ignored their howling fury. The stolen power pulsed within his veins, and the time for wandering the shadows had passed. Armed with the divine fire required to craft unparalleled sentient weapons, he departed Molech to begin the genesis of his ultimate generals. With the fire stolen from the dark gods of Molech, the Emperor returned to the throne world to play at being a creator. Deep beneath the Himalayan mountains, sealed within the ultimate gene laboratories of Terra, and aided by the esoteric fleshcrafters of Ullanor, he began his most audacious work. He forged 20 vessels of absolute perfection. These were the Primarchs. They were meant to be the immortal generals of his nascent empire, demigods shaped from his own genetic sequence and infused with the stolen warp fire of the Immaterium. Yet the master of mankind did not weave this miracle of bioalchemy alone. There was another architect to the Primarch Project, a fellow perpetual of ancient and unparalleled power. Her name was Erda. She was the genetic mother to these 20 sons, providing the mortal biological anchor that allowed the Emperor's divine power to take flesh. Erda loved the infants gestating within their armored vats. She saw them as children, as living souls deserving of nurturing and light. The Emperor, however, saw only weapons. In his pursuit of cosmic dominion, he had shed the fragile trappings of his own humanity, excising empathy and warmth to become a creature of pure, calculating will. He did not intend for his sons to be loved. He intended for them to be the blood-stained vanguards of a merciless galactic conquest. When Erda realized the horrifying truth of their destiny, a profound and desperate disillusionment took root in her soul. She could not bear to see her children become loveless butchers for a tyrannical father. Driven by a mother's devastating compassion, she committed an act of treason that would doom the galaxy to endless war. Erda sabotaged the arcane defenses of the Imperial dungeon. By collapsing the Geller fields and psychic wards that shielded the gestation chambers, she exposed her creations to the nightmare realm of the Immaterium. In her desperate attempt to deny the Emperor his weapons, she threw open the gates to the very horrors he had sought to cheat. The Chaos Gods, hungry to reclaim what had been stolen from them at Molech, struck with cataclysmic fury. A howling vortex of unreality tore through the Himalayan vaults. The 20 gestation capsules were ripped from their moorings, swallowed by the warp, and violently scattered across the furthest, darkest corners of the galaxy. The infants were cast into the void, utterly vulnerable to the whims of the Dark Pantheon. This disaster was born entirely of the Emperor's own profound arrogance. His absolute failure to understand the enduring power of human emotion, his inability to comprehend a mother's desperate love, handed the ruinous powers their first and greatest victory. The pristine instruments of his grand design were gone, lost amongst Xenos stars and shadowed worlds. The Emperor was left staring at the ruins of his absolute control. Stripped of his immortal generals, he realized that the galaxy would not simply fall into his grasp, but would have to be taken by force and fire. He would have to search the cosmos to reclaim his scattered sons, unleashing a tide of endless violence upon the stars. Deprived of his nascent generals in their infancy, the master of mankind stepped outward into the dark sea of stars. He did not venture forth armed merely with bolter and blade. His greatest weapon of conquest was an ideology of absolute cold rationality. This was the Imperial truth. To the uninitiated, it appeared as strict philosophical atheism, a decree that all gods were false and all religions were relics of a barbaric past. Yet this doctrine was no mere intellectual exercise. It was a calculated psychic defense mechanism engineered on a galactic scale. The Emperor understood the true nature of the Immaterium. He knew that the monstrous entities of the warp fed upon human emotion, sustained by the zealous fervor of worship and the trembling prayers of the faithful. By eradicating belief, the Emperor sought to starve the dark gods into submission. If humanity denied the divine, the warp would find no purchase in the mortal realm. Logic would sever the feeding lines of the Pantheon. To manifest this grand design, the Imperial iterators were unleashed across 1,000 worlds. These master propagandists painted a glorious vision of a galaxy ruled by human supremacy and enlightened science. Behind their golden words marched the Legiones Astartes, the transhuman enforcers of this new secular dawn. Herein lay the cruelest irony of the Great Crusade. To secure mankind's deliverance from the nightmarish horrors of the warp, the Emperor became a tyrant as merciless as the dark gods he sought to starve. Countless human civilizations, harboring benign faiths and peaceful creeds, were given a singular choice. They could abandon the gods of their ancestors, or they could burn. Billions of innocent men and women who simply refused to forsake their deeply held spiritual convictions were ruthlessly slaughtered. Cities of unimaginable beauty were reduced to ash because they dared to build temples. The Emperor crowned himself a tyrant steeped in oceans of blood, all to prevent the subjugation of the human soul by the tyrants of the Immaterium. Every burnt altar and shattered idol formed a psychic bulwark against the creeping chaos of the warp. The Imperial truth was carved into the flesh of the galaxy with a chainsword. System by system, the Great Crusade reclaimed the shattered fragments of humanity. As the lost Primarchs were found and placed at the head of their respective legions, the pace of conquest accelerated into a blinding storm of unification. The sheer scale of the Emperor's brutal logic had seemingly forged an invincible dominion. The galaxy was brought to heel beneath the banner of the double-headed eagle. The boundless frontier had finally yielded to the relentless march of human rationality and military might. With the cosmos bathed in the blood of non-believers and Xenos alike, the ultimate triumph of the Great Crusade drew near. A pinnacle of martial glory approached, a moment of such absolute victory that the master of mankind would soon look upon the conquered stars and decide his time on the front lines had reached its end. The Great Crusade reached its magnificent and bloody zenith upon the mud of Ullanor. The greatest orc empire to ever blight the stars was ground to dust beneath the treads of the legends Astartes. Millions of greenskins were slaughtered, their brutal domain shattered by the combined might of the Emperor and his sons. A profound silence fell across the pacified galaxy. The grand vision of a united humanity seemed finally within grasp. To commemorate this unparalleled victory, the Emperor orchestrated a triumph unlike any seen before or since. Continental parade grounds were carved from the conquered world. The martial splendor of the Imperium was laid bare under a weeping sky. It was here, amidst the roaring adulation of millions, that the Emperor made a proclamation that would alter the destiny of the cosmos. He elevated Horus Lupercal, first among equals, to the rank of War Master. Into the hands of his most beloved son, he placed the supreme command of the Great Crusade. Yet the triumph of Ullanor was a hollow crown. In the very moment of humanity's greatest victory, the master of mankind turned his back upon the stars. Without warning and devoid of any comforting explanation, the Emperor announced his immediate return to Terra. He relinquished the direct prosecution of the war. He gathered his personal retinues, boarded the grand flagship Imperator Somnium, and set course for the Sol system, leaving the expeditionary fleets behind. To the Primarchs, standing in the ashes of their monumental victory, this sudden departure was a physical blow. The Creator who had forged them for war, who had fought beside them on 1,000 burning worlds, had simply walked away. A suffocating silence took the place of his guiding voice. This lack of communication was the Emperor's most catastrophic miscalculation. In the vacuum of his absence, the seeds of doubt were sown deep within the genetically crafted minds of the demigods. They were weapons forged for a crusade that was nearing its end. They began to wonder what place transhuman butchers would have in the peaceful empire they had bled to build. Resentment took root in the shadows of their collective psyche. Horus, though draped in the mantle of War Master, felt the crushing and unsupported weight of the entire galaxy pressing upon his shoulders. Beneath his immense pride lay a terrifying insecurity, a primal fear that he had been promoted only to be discarded. The other Primarchs looked upon the void their father left behind and felt the bitter sting of abandonment. They were demigods of war, suddenly left without a master to aim them. It was precisely this feeling of obsolescence, this festering wound of unarticulated betrayal, that the ruinous powers of the warp had been waiting for. Chaos needs only a hairline fracture to shatter a soul. The Emperor, in his boundless hubris and tragic silence, had provided the perfect crack. He had retreated to the throne world, locking himself away behind the colossal gates of the Imperial palace. He left his sons blind to the truth of his grand design, abandoning them to wonder what secret endeavor could possibly be more vital than the conquest of the stars. While the Great Crusade burned across the galactic void, its supreme architect descended into the darkest bedrock of Throne World. Deep beneath the crushing tectonic weight of the Himalayan mountains lay the Imperial dungeon. This was no mere vault for the conquered relics of unification. It was a grim crucible where the destiny of our species was to be rewritten in silence and shadows. Here, far from the adulation of countless trillions, the Emperor of mankind beheld a secret older than human history. Deep within the planetary crust, the Emperor began construction of a marvel of esoteric science and arcane engineering. He sought to forge a colossal psychic conduit designed to pierce the veil of reality and tunnel directly into the ancient, labyrinthine pathways of the Webway, a realm forged by the Old Ones. To understand the magnitude of this discovery is to peer into the fundamental architecture of reality itself. This derelict gate was a threshold to the Webway. The Webway is a labyrinthine dimension existing perfectly out of phase with both the material universe and the turbulent nightmare of the immaterium. It is an infinitely complex network of interstitial arteries, a stabilized realm shielded entirely from the predatory gaze of the Neverborn. Within its hidden corridors, vessels could traverse the vastness of the galaxy without ever plunging into the demonic tides of the warp. It was the ultimate prize for a nascent empire. It was a safe harbor in an infinite sea of madness. The Emperor did not merely wish to study this Xenos relic. His grand design was to repair the shattered gate and forge a new, entirely human-controlled artery into the Webway. The scale of this subterranean endeavor defies all mortal comprehension. Millions of indentured laborers toiled and perished in the claustrophobic dark, excavating impossibly massive vaults large enough to swallow entire hive cities. A vast enclave of Mechanicum adepts, sworn to unbreakable oaths of absolute secrecy, labored endlessly over esoteric blueprints. These cybernetic artisans forged cyclopean engines of brass and iron, attempting the near-blasphemous task of marrying crude human machinery to the impossibly elegant psychoplastics of ancient Xenos technology. The sheer psychic resonance of this fusion required constant, unyielding vigilance. Ranks of the Legio Custodes stood watch over the grinding gears and humming conduits, their gleaming golden armor constantly tarnished by the subterranean grit. Throughout it all, a suffocating silence reigned over the dungeon. A spoken word was considered a treacherous luxury, for the very walls vibrated with the volatile energies of the warp, constantly pushing against the embryonic warding fields. The mechanical choir of the machine spirits was the only hymn permitted in these lightless depths. Yet the construction of this subterranean gateway was not merely an act of supreme material engineering. It was the physical manifestation of a far more desperate truth looming over the species. The master of mankind knew that humanity was rapidly evolving into a fully psychic race, doomed by its own potential to attract the ravenous hunger of the ruinous powers. The colossal physical machinery bleeding power beneath the mountains was but the first necessary step in a much grander design. To completely break the eternal human dependency on the warp and sever the psychic umbilical cord feeding the dark gods, a more profound biological and philosophical transformation was required. The vast labyrinth of the Emperor's physical architecture was merely a vessel for a far more desperate biological truth. For beneath the grand conquest of the stars lay a cosmic ticking clock, one measured not in years, but in the mutating flesh and soul of the human species. The master of mankind possessed a terrible foresight, a vision that peered past the fleeting triumphs of the Great Crusade and into the doom of our fundamental nature. Humanity was evolving. With every passing generation, the psychic potential of our race awakened in greater and more violent numbers. We were inevitably transforming into a fully psychic species, mirroring the tragic and bloody ascent of the ancient Eldari. This was the profound existential threat that drove the Emperor to such desperate and secretive extremes. He knew the dark history of the galaxy, and he understood the unfathomable price of an unchecked psychic ascension. Without his divine intervention, this mass awakening would not elevate mankind to enlightenment. It would burn the galaxy to ash. An uncontrolled blossoming of human psychic might would tear the veil of reality asunder, drowning a million worlds in the raw, mutating tides of the immaterium. Worse still, the collective psychic agony and madness of an unprepared humanity would inevitably coagulate within the warp. We would birth a new dark god of chaos, just as the arrogant Eldari had screamed Slaanesh into existence during their apocalyptic fall. The Emperor absolutely refused to let mankind become the incubator for another ruinous deity. Therefore, the Imperial Webway was never intended to be a mere network of logistical arteries for the expeditionary fleets. It was to be a massive quarantine zone. It was a sealed vault of impossibly ancient dimensions, utterly shielded from the predatory gaze of the warp. The Emperor sought to sever humanity from the Immaterium entirely. By claiming the Webway, the Imperium would no longer require the mutant navigators to steer their vulnerable vessels through the hellish tides of the Empyrean. The agonizing chorus of astropaths, whose souls constantly burned like fragile beacons to cosmic predators, would be silenced and rendered utterly obsolete. Mankind would travel, communicate, and exist wholly independent of the warp. The ultimate ambition of the Master of Mankind was to migrate the psychic evolution of our entire species into the protected corridors of the labyrinthine dimension. There, safely shielded from the whispered temptations of chaos and the endless predations of demons, humanity could safely mature into its psychic destiny. He would shepherd us through our most vulnerable biological epoch, effectively starving the chaos gods of the raw emotional resonance they desperately craved. Yet to orchestrate a transfiguration of this unfathomable magnitude, the Emperor required a singular anchor. Such a monumental migration of the human soul could not rely upon cold machinery or even his own isolated psychic might alone. He needed an instrument of absolute spiritual and physical authority to forge this new paradigm, a creation capable of bridging the mortal realm and the divine to reshape the very architecture of reality. To shepherd mankind into the labyrinthine depths of the Webway was only the first step of a much grander design. For humanity to truly evolve in that sovereign dimension, they required a guide of unparalleled magnitude. It is here that we must cast aside the modern dogma of the ecclesiarchy. Look upon the golden throne not as it is now, a morbid engine of life support and endless agony, but as it was when it was first completed. It was never forged to be a seat of terrestrial government. It was not built to be a gilded prison for a decaying corpse. The golden throne was a psychic amplifier of unfathomable power. It was an engine of ascension. It was the God-maker. The Master of Mankind understood that his physical form was a tether, a limitation bound to the material universe. To protect his flock in the immaterial pathways of the Webway, he would have to shed his mortal coil entirely. The theory whispered among the deepest vaults of the Black Library is one of sheer, staggering ambition. The Emperor intended to use the humming, raw potential of the Golden Throne to project his very soul into the Webway. He sought to untether his consciousness from the physical realm and expand his spirit across the entire network. By doing so, he would create an unbreakable psychic shield around humanity, a bastion of pure intellect and will that the horrors of the warp could never pierce. This was the absolute rejection of apotheosis. The Emperor was engineering a strictly secular salvation, a sanctuary of cold reason and perfect order. Within the safe confines of the Webway, humanity would be guided by his supreme, albeit mortal intellect, shepherded through their psychic metamorphosis, free from the taint of worship. He would not be a deity born of chaotic emotion and nightmare, but a sovereign entity forged by logic, purpose, and boundless sacrifice. In this elevated state, his guiding light would render the primordial annihilator obsolete. The chaos gods would be starved of their mortal playthings, left to wither in the howling dark as humanity thrived beyond their reach. The God-maker was the crucible through which the Emperor would become the absolute master of mankind's spiritual destiny. Such an undertaking was the most delicate and dangerous endeavor in the history of the galaxy. The physical and spiritual transfiguration of the Emperor demanded singular focus. The Golden Throne resonated with the raw energy of a newborn star, waiting for the final calibrations of its master. Yet an ascension of this magnitude could not be achieved amidst the noise of a turbulent, warring galaxy. The material realm had to be stabilized, and the countless gears of the Imperium had to be locked perfectly into place. To ensure that absolutely no one interfered with this sacred, fragile metamorphosis, the Emperor required absolute obedience from his subjects. He began to execute a series of swift, uncompromising political decrees that would isolate Terra and blind his own sons to the truth of his grand design. The fragility of the Imperial dungeon demanded more than physical walls of auramite and iron. To forge a tunnel into the Webway, the Emperor required absolute, undisturbed serenity within the immaterium. Any disturbance in the warp threatened to draw the hungry eyes of the Pantheon toward Terra. Thus, the Master of Mankind summoned his sons to the obsidian amphitheatre of Nikaea. It was here that the Great Crusade faced its most pivotal and destructive trial. History often remembers the Edict of Nikaea as an act of fearful prejudice against the mutant. It is widely recorded as the moment the Emperor bowed to the superstitions of narrow minds. This is a tragic lie. The decree was born of cold, terrifying necessity. The psychic might of the Space Marine legions was creating a deafening clamour in the Sea of Souls. Every battle won with warp lightning and telekinetic fury echoed like a beacon across the endless tides of the warp. The Librarius divisions were practically signalling the location of the human race to the waiting predators of the dark. To keep the ruinous powers ignorant of his great work beneath the Imperial Palace, the Emperor needed complete psychic silence. He decreed that all Legions Astartes would permanently disband their librarian disciplines. No sorcery was to be tolerated. No warpcraft was to be conjured in the Emperor's name. Magnus the Red, the Crimson King of Prospero, stood before his brothers humiliated and utterly furious. His life was devoted to the pursuit of esoteric knowledge, and now he was commanded to burn his own life's work. Yet the Emperor remained an immovable monolith of authority. He demanded absolute obedience from Magnus and all the others. Crucially, the Master of Mankind offered no explanation for this harsh command. He deemed the truth of the Webway project too dangerous to share, even with his most gifted sons. This silence would doom the galaxy. By outlawing the psychic arts, the Emperor believed he was securing the stealth required to outmaneuver the gods of chaos. In truth, he had just blinded his own watchdogs. The librarians were the only warriors capable of piercing the veil and combating the immaterial horrors of the warp on equal footing. While mass-reactive bolts and grinding chain teeth could disrupt a physical demon host, true banishment of such malefic horrors often demanded the arcane fire of the librarius. By grounding his finest psychic weapons, the Emperor left the legions entirely defenseless against the true nature of the enemy. He stripped the armor from their souls just as the storm was gathering. The legions marched back out into the void, ignorant, mundane, and terribly vulnerable. While the Emperor labored in absolute secrecy to starve the masters of the warp, other forces in the galaxy were actively seeking them out. Deep in the dark corners of the cosmos, men who had been denied the truth were finally finding it on their own terms. While the Master of Mankind veiled Terra in silence to hide from the horrors of the warp, another son sought out the dark. Lorgar Aurelian, the Golden One, had been utterly broken upon the ashen plains of Monarchia. His perfect city was ground into dust by the Emperor's decree, his faith shattered by the very idol he sought to elevate. Bereft of purpose, the Urizen turned his weeping eyes away from the galactic core and cast his gaze toward the bleeding fringes of reality. He demanded an answer to the spiritual void left by his father's violent atheism. Guided by treacherous whispers and the bitter counsel of his closest lieutenants, Lorgar embarked upon a pilgrimage into the great eye of Terra. There, amid the screaming nebulae and the churning nightmare of the Empyrean, the Primarch of the Word-Bearers found what he had been seeking. He discovered the primordial truth. Gods did exist in the unlit depths of the cosmos, ancient and terrible beyond mortal comprehension. They were the ruinous powers of chaos, entities of limitless malice and undeniable divinity. Where the Emperor had sought to starve these pantheons by imposing a cold, secular lie upon the galaxy, Lorgar saw only the doom of the human species. He realized that trying to starve the infinite was an act of arrogant madness. In his corrupted wisdom, the Urizen came to believe that the only path to humanity's survival lay in utter submission. he envisioned a dark symbiosis where mortals served as faithful vessels, and the gods bestowed their awful blessings in return. A profound and catastrophic collision of ideologies took root in Lorgar's soul. The imperial truth was not merely a lie, it was a profound hypocrisy. Through his communion with the Neverborn, Lorgar learned that the Emperor had bargained with these very deities at the dawn of his crusade. The Master of Mankind had stolen fire from the warp to forge the Primarchs, only to deny the architects of his power their rightful worship. Lorgar saw his father not as a savior, but as a thieving tyrant attempting to usurp the heavens and ascend as a god himself. This revelation forged a cold, zealous resolve within the fallen Primarch. He would not allow humanity to perish for the sake of an emperor who hid his own divine theft behind the mask of science and reason. In the shadowed holds of his armada, the word-bearers secretly cast aside their oaths and swore themselves to the pantheon of chaos. The first seeds of the Great Rebellion were sown not in battle, but in prayer. Yet Lorgar knew that his legion alone could not break the back of the nascent Imperium. He needed an instrument of unparalleled martial might to tear down the false empire of Terra. He needed the beloved sun, the rising star of the Great Crusade, to be the vanguard of his holy war. With careful poisoned words and dark sorcery, Lorgar began to lay a snare that would bring the Emperor's greatest general to his knees. The architect of ruin had laid his snare upon the swamp-choked moon of Davin. Here, the Warmaster faced a rebellion led by a man he once called friend, the corrupted planetary governor Yugan Temba. But Temba was merely a vessel for a far older malice. In the suffocating gloom of the plague-ridden swamps, the treacherous governor struck Horus with the stolen anathema. This Xenos blade was no simple weapon. It possessed a dark sentience, bred to understand the unique biology of its victim. A single scratch was enough to bring the greatest of the Emperor's sons to his knees. The venom bypassed the supreme genetic enhancements of the Primarch, rotting Horus from within. As the Warmaster lay dying, his desperate Mournival dragged him to the only saviors they could find. They surrendered their beloved gene-sire to the native priests of the Serpent Lodge. This was exactly as the first chaplain Erebus had planned. Within the fever dreams of the Lodge, Erebus did not tempt Horus with crude promises of power or visions of mindless slaughter. Chaos is far more insidious than simple malevolence. Wearing the stolen face of Hasta Sejanus, the Warmaster's most beloved and fallen captain, Erebus showed Horus a terrifying vision of the future. The Warmaster looked upon the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. He saw a galaxy where the imperial truth had been eradicated. He beheld a tyrannical theocracy where the Emperor ruled not as a mortal leader, but as an ascended, worshipped god. Worse still, Horus looked for himself and his brothers in this future, and found nothing. The Primarchs were forgotten, erased from history, or utterly destroyed after their usefulness had expired. Erebus weaponized the Emperor's own secrecy against him. He convinced Horus that the Great Crusade was merely a selfish path to his father's own divine ascension. Here lies the great and terrible paradox of the Horus Heresy. Chaos did not lie to the Warmaster. The dark gods showed him the absolute, undeniable truth of the future. Horus saw the fanaticism, the ignorance and the endless suffering of an imperium chained to a god-emperor. He chose to rebel to prevent this horrific vision from coming to pass. Yet it was his very rebellion that destroyed the secular dream. His treachery crippled his father, forced the emperor onto the golden throne, and guaranteed the birth of the exact theocratic nightmare he had sacrificed his honor to prevent. Chaos used the truth to spin the ultimate lie. When Horus emerged from the Serpent Lodge, the noble hero of the Imperium was dead. In his place stood a dark vessel, a usurper resolved to burn the galaxy to deny his father godhood. He would wage a war of annihilation against Terra itself. But such a momentous turning of the tides could not go unnoticed in the Immaterium. The psychic echoes of this monumental betrayal flared like a dying star within the warp. Across the galaxy, a loyal brother felt this terrible tremor. Armed with forbidden sorcery, This devoted son prepared to risk everything, even his father's ultimate wrath, to deliver a warning before the trap could snap shut. Far from the festering corruption taking hold within the Warmaster, another tragedy was already unfolding upon the shimmering world of Prospero. Magnus the Red, the Crimson King and Primarch of the Thousand Suns, cast his peerless mind into the turbulent tides of the great ocean. Through forbidden sorceries and scrying rituals, he pierced the veil of reality. What he witnessed within the shifting madness of the warp drove him to the brink of absolute despair. He saw his beloved brother Horus yielding to the primordial annihilator. He watched as the most favored son was swallowed by the dark promises of chaos. Panic gripped the Cyclopean giant. The scale of the treason was unimaginable, threatening to consume the entire galaxy in a storm of blood and fire. Magnus knew that a warning must reach Terra immediately. Conventional astropathic choirs were far too slow, their fragmented whispers easily intercepted or distorted by the treacherous currents of the Empyrean. The message was too vital to entrust to mortal minds. He had to deliver it himself directly to his father. Here lay the fatal flaw of the Crimson King. Magnus possessed an intellect unmatched among his peers, yet it was poisoned by a boundless, staggering hubris. He genuinely believed that his mastery over the warp was absolute and infallible. The Emperor had strictly forbidden the use of sorcery at the Council of Nikaea, yet Magnus cast the edict aside without hesitation. In his arrogance, he reasoned that the sheer apocalyptic magnitude of Horus turning traitor justified any transgression of Imperial law. Magnus did not know what awaited him on Terra. He was completely blind to the existence of the Emperor's grand undertaking beneath the Imperial palace. The Master of Mankind was building a bridge into the ancient Webway, a delicate and secret project shielded by arcane wards of immense power. Ignorant of this fragile truth, Magnus prepared a spell of unparalleled magnitude to hurl his consciousness across the stars. Such a tremendous working of magic demanded a terrible toll. Within the gleaming pyramids of Tizca, the Thousand Suns gathered to empower their gene-sire. A grand and horrific ritual of blood sacrifice was enacted to tear open the boundaries of the materium. Thralls and servants were offered to the abyss, their life essence fueling the staggering power required for the Crimson King to transcend his mortal shell. Surging with the stolen vitality of his subjects and the raw energy of the warp, the psychic avatar of Magnus the Red erupted from Prospero. His astral projection tore through the immaterial realm like a blazing comet of pure thought and desperation. He surged toward the throne world with the speed of a dying star, determined to save the Imperium at any cost. He did not know that his path of salvation was aimed directly at the heart of his father's greatest dream. Across the raging gulfs of the Empyrean, the astral projection of Magnus the Red descended upon the cradle of mankind. He arrived at Terra bearing the direst of warnings, a message of betrayal that would shake the very foundations of the galaxy. Yet his frantic flight was halted not by the predators of the deep warp, but by a barrier of incandescent psychic gold. It was an aegis of unimaginable complexity and raw power, woven by the master of mankind himself. Magnus had discovered the wards protecting the Imperial palace, a psychic bulwark designed to shield the Emperor's secret endeavor to conquer the Webway. No sorcery known to the Crimson King could pierce this divine fortification. His desperate pleas battered against the golden wall, echoing uselessly into the immaterial void. Time was running out, and the survival of the Imperium demanded that his warning of treason be heard. In his moment of supreme frustration, a profound presence manifested within the swirling tides of the warp. It did not appear as a monstrous nightmare of chaos, but as an entity of vast, benevolent majesty. It was Tzeentch, the architect of fate, cloaked in the guise of a sympathetic leviathan of the great ocean. The entity whispered promises of limitless power, offering the exact esoteric strength required to breach the unyielding barrier. Blinded by his own unshakable arrogance and convinced of his righteous purpose, Magnus reached out and accepted the tainted gift. He drew the boundless, chaotic energy into his astral form, swelling with the stolen might of a god. With a single devastating psychic blow, he struck the Emperor's masterwork. The golden wards shattered like fragile glass under a warhammer. A cataclysmic shockwave tore through the fabric of reality, ripping a jagged, bleeding wound across the metaphysical heavens. The physical backlash was instantaneous and profoundly horrifying. Deep beneath the surface of Terra, within the clandestine vaults of the Imperial dungeon, absolute devastation was unleashed upon the material plane. Irreplaceable arcane machinery exploded in screaming showers of lethal shrapnel. Thousands of psychic adepts and mortal laborers were incinerated in a single heartbeat, their flesh and bone turning to drifting ash upon the scorched floors. At the center of this localized apocalypse, the Emperor of Mankind endured a catastrophic rupture. His supreme psychic chrysalis, the delicate and absolute concentration holding the nascent Webway gate closed, was violently and irreparably torn asunder. The great work of ascension, the Emperor's ultimate dream of freeing humanity from the tyranny of the immaterium, was broken in a fraction of a second. Suspended in the roiling ethereal realm, the awful truth dawned upon Magnus. The benevolent entity that had lent him strength dissolved into a chorus of mocking, infinite laughter, revealing the triumphant malice of the Changer of Ways. Magnus had not saved the Imperium of man. He had delivered its death blow. The warning of rebellion turned to ashes in his spectral mouth as he gazed down at the ruin he had wrought. The shattered wards left the absolute defenses of the throne world bleeding and completely open. A path had been violently cleared not for a loyal son, but for an endless tide of demonic malice waiting hungrily in the dark beneath the palace. The tragedy of Magnus the Red was not merely a failure of judgment, but a cataclysm that doomed the very species he sought to save. By shattering the ancient psychic wards woven beneath the Imperial palace, the Crimson King punched a ragged, bleeding wound directly from the Empyrean into the Emperor's grand design. The human-built sections of the Webway, painstakingly carved from the chaotic ether to safely shepherd mankind across the stars, collapsed under the sudden metaphysical pressure. Where there was once a shielded corridor intended to liberate humanity from the warp, there was now an open, shrieking chasm. Through this jagged breach poured the nightmare hosts of the ruinous powers. It was an endless, churning tide of the never-born, a demonic horde born of pure malice and endless entropy. They surged into the shattered subterranean pathways, drawn by the blinding psychic beacon of Terra itself. Horrors of brass and blood, shambling beasts of pestilence, writhing phantom shapes of forbidden temptation, and serpentine weavers of fate, all united in a singular, devastating purpose. Millions of unnatural entities trampled over the psychic circuitry of the Imperial Project. They hungered to tear through the rusted gates of the Imperial dungeon, shatter the final barriers, and consume the cradle of humanity. The stakes of this silent invasion were absolute. If this infinite tide of maleficence were to breach the final doors and spill into the physical realm, Terra would be instantly annihilated. Our throne world would be swallowed in an apocalyptic warp storm, expanding outward to consume the Sol system. It would create a new Eye of Terror, a colossal tear in reality that would drown the entire galaxy in eternal night. The master of mankind, the immortal architect of a golden age, was suddenly faced with the immediate destruction of everything he had fought millennia to achieve. In that dark and terrible hour, the Emperor of Mankind did the only thing he could. He abandoned his esoteric labors beneath the palace, turned his back on the dream of the Webway, and ascended the cold steps of the Golden Throne. It was not a coronation of triumph, but a grim imprisonment. The Godmaker machine was instantly repurposed into a desperate, agonizing psychic dam. The Emperor cast his boundless mental might into the device, using his own supreme consciousness to physically hold the metaphysical door shut against the infinite, crushing pressure of the warp. Trapped upon this glorious engine of torment, the Emperor fought a silent, unending battle against the full, unified fury of the Chaos gods. Every ounce of his godlike focus was required simply to keep the rift from expanding and drowning Terra in raw, unfiltered warp stuff. He was anchored in place, unable to lead his armies, unable to speak with his sons, unable to strike down the traitors gathering in the physical universe. Yet even the supreme power of the Master of Mankind could not hold the physical remnants of the Webway alone. The demons were already inside the tunnels, gnawing at the crumbling edges of reality and clawing their way toward the inner sanctum. The psychic dam held the overarching breach from collapsing completely, but the physical tunnels themselves required a more visceral defense. Flesh, blood, and bolter would have to march into the subterranean dark to hold the line. The breach in the Emperor's great work did not herald a single battle, but the dawn of a secret and terrible epoch. Beneath the gilded foundations of the Imperial Palace, a hidden war raged for 5 agonizing years. This was the War Within the Webway, a conflict fought not upon shattered worlds, but within a burning, surreal dimension of Xenos glass and psychically forged wraithbone. Into this nightmare stepped the Legio Custodes and the Silent Sisterhood. They were the absolute pinnacle of Imperial might, hurled into a meat grinder of infinite horror. The 10,000 were never meant to be mere soldiers. They were the Emperor's companions, his artists, his philosophers and his scholars, designed to stand as the enlightened exemplars of a conquered galaxy. Now they were reduced to blood-soaked trench fighters in a realm that defied sanity. The demonic horde was a tide without end. For every abomination cast back into the warp, a dozen more took its place, pouring through the shattered wards of the Xenos labyrinth. To combat this infinite malice, the Sisters of Silence stood shoulder to shoulder with the Golden Giants. These soulless blanks formed a living bulwark of nullification, their very presence repelling the raw warp taint that threatened to consume the passageways. Together they held the line in the dark. Yet the psychological toll of this shadow war was staggering. Warriors like Diocletian Koros fought without rest, their golden armor tarnished with the filth of 1,000 slaughtered nightmares. They fought in absolute secrecy, cut off from the light of the sun, knowing that the rest of the galaxy burned in the fires of a massive civil war. There was no glory to be found within the impossible geometries of the Webway. There were no remembrances to record their heroics, no monuments carved to honor their sacrifices, and no respite from the ceaseless screaming of the never-born. They merely fought, bled, and died in the shadows. Here lay the cruelest tragedy of the Emperor's grand design. The Custodes were being slaughtered in droves to protect a dream that was already dead. The Imperial Webway, meant to be the salvation of the human species, had become a festering wound in the fabric of reality. The Golden Warriors spent their ageless vitality defending broken tunnels that led nowhere but to damnation. Their numbers dwindled with each passing month of the 5-year slaughter. Exhaustion settled into their very bones, a weariness so profound it tested the limits of their genetic perfection. The Silent Sisters fell by the hundreds, their pariah gifts burning out under the sheer, crushing weight of the demonic ocean. Still, they held the vanguard, buying the Imperium another day, another hour, another breath. But the warp is a realm of eternal malice, and no amount of golden blood could forever stem the tide of infinity. For 5 agonizing years, the 10,000 had bled in the subterranean dark to hold the impossible city. Now, the streets of Kalistar crumbled under the weight of an infinite screaming tide. The warp had breached the ancient Xenos pathways in absolute totality. Leading this apocalyptic host was a terror birthed not of mere nightmare, but of humanity's primal sin. It was Drachni N, the echo of the first murder. Where this demonic abomination walked, reality itself curdled and died. It was a force of pure, unadulterated malice that tore through the golden ranks of the Legio Custodes as though they were nothing but parchment. The surviving custodians and the shattered remnants of the Mi Chani Kum were pushed to the very brink of annihilation. There could be no victory in this realm of madness. Only a desperate, bloody retreat remained to save the final defenders of the throne world. It was then, in the absolute depths of despair, that the master of mankind was forced to intervene. Leaving the physical confines of the Golden Throne, the Emperor cast his blazing psychic might directly into the Webway. His light was a blinding sun against the encroaching dark. Under his golden aegis, the battered survivors dragged their wounded back toward the earthly threshold. The Emperor stood as the ultimate bulwark against the shrieking warp, holding back the infinite malice of chaos through sheer, unfathomable willpower. Yet even his godlike strength could only delay the inevitable. As the last of the bloodied Custodes crossed the threshold into the Imperial dungeon, the great portal was abandoned. The massive adamantium doors beneath the Imperial palace slammed shut with a finality that echoed through the souls of all who witnessed it. The physical gate was barred forever. The warding mechanisms screamed as they locked the nightmare out of Terra. In the grim silence that followed, surrounded by the broken bodies of his greatest warriors, the Emperor looked upon the ruin of his ultimate ambition. The custodian Diocletian Koros, desperate for a shred of hope in the suffocating gloom, sought guidance from his master. He asked what they must do next to reclaim the Webway and save the Imperium. The Emperor of mankind, burdened by a sorrow deeper than the oceans of ancient earth, looked upon his loyal servant. He spoke words that extinguished the very light of the future, a confession more terrifying than any demonic howl I don't know. With those devastating words, the great endeavor was dead. The grand vision of safely guiding the human species into a psychic ascendance away from the thirsting gods was reduced to ash. The secret war in the dark was lost. There was no longer any escape from the madness of the galaxy. The Emperor would now be eternally bound to the Golden Throne, forced to hold the breached gate shut with his own mind. And as the silence settled over the subterranean vaults, a new and terrible reality dawned. The war for the Webway had ended, but the true apocalypse was just beginning. The eyes of the Imperium now turned upward toward the poisoned skies as the traitor armada prepared to bring the slaughter to the very surface of Terra. Beneath the crust of the throne world, the greatest ambition of mankind lay in ruins, but upon the surface, the true nightmare was only just beginning. The armada of the War Master tore translation holes through the fabric of the Sol system, eclipsing the stars with a mechanized swarm of unimaginable scale. Horus Lupercal had arrived to claim the crown of his father. Yet the siege of Terra was never destined to be a mere war of attrition or a conventional military campaign. It was the physical manifestation of ultimate failure. It was the absolute death of reason, brought to the very steps of the Imperial palace. As the orbital bombardment shattered the lithosphere, the metaphysical wards of the cradle of humanity began to fracture. The presence of the War Master, engorged and bloated with the undivided power of the four dark gods, acted as a lodestone for the immaterium. The warp did not merely invade Terra, it began to overwrite it. The fundamental laws of reality broke down under the immense spiritual pressure of the ruinous powers. The skies above the Imperial palace bled in hues of bruised purple and sickly immaterium green. Gravity shifted and inverted across ruined cityscapes, turning shattered spires into floating tombs. The veil grew so thin that the air itself shrieked, and nightmares of claw and fang stepped from the shadows to walk the earth. Demons made flesh slaughtered the innocent and the augmented alike. In any other age, the master of mankind would have banished this madness with a single thought. He was the greatest psychic powerhouse the galaxy had ever known, a being capable of forcing entire legions to their knees with a whisper. Now, he was reduced to a helpless battery. His supreme and singular focus was entirely consumed by the unending torment of the Golden Throne. He sat paralyzed in the dark, pouring every ounce of his godlike will into holding the shattered Webway gate shut against the infinite tides of the warp. Because he was tethered to this apocalyptic burden, he could not project his psychic might into the heavens to shield his world. He could not raise a blade to defend his people. He could only sit in agonizing silence, psychically aware of every horror unfolding above him. He felt the agonizing deaths of his loyal sons upon the breached walls of the palace, yet he was utterly powerless to intervene. The physical and spiritual attrition was absolute. The defenders of Terra fought with unmatched valor, but they were dying against a tide of unending madness. As the outer walls fell and the inner sanctums were breached, the bitter truth became inescapable. A war fought on two fronts, against endless traitors without and endless demons below, could never be won from a static throne. The Emperor of mankind was being bled dry, and his throne world was dissolving into the warp. The stalemate was a slow execution. If the Imperium was to survive, the agonizing anchor of the Golden Throne would have to be abandoned. A final, desperate gambit would need to be played, forcing the father to rise from his torture and face the monstrous avatar that his favored son had become. High above the ruined cradle of mankind, the void shields of the vengeful spirit fell silent. It was an impossible occurrence, an overt invitation from the arch-traitor, or perhaps a momentary lapse of hubristic vulnerability. The Emperor of mankind knew the stark truth of the moment. He had to teleport aboard that cursed flagship and strike Horus Lupercal down. Yet the Master of mankind was a prisoner to his own salvation. To rise from the Golden Throne would mean the instant collapse of the psychic wards holding back the ruined Webway. Terra would be drowned in an endless tide of demonic filth, consumed by the hungry warp in a matter of seconds. The entire soul system would be dragged screaming into the immaterium. He was bound to the agonizing machinery of the seat, unable to strike the killing blow while his throne world bled out around him. It was then that his oldest friend stepped forward from the flickering shadows of the sanctum. Malcador, First Lord of Terra, offered his final and most terrible service to the Imperium. Though he was a perpetual, an immortal being who had walked at the Emperor's side through the darkest ages of old Earth, Malcador was not a god. He was merely a man of unparalleled psychic might, worn thin by the relentless demands of the heresy. To sit upon the Golden Throne in the Emperor's stead was a death sentence, an absolute annihilation of body and soul. Yet the Sigillite did not hesitate to pay the ultimate price. The exchange of the apocalyptic burden was a moment of agonizing, transcendent power. As the Emperor rose, his trusted servant took his place upon the unforgiving metal of the psychic amplifier. The physical toll was immediate and horrific. The sheer, crushing weight of the warp breach slammed into Malcador, funneling an ocean of shrieking madness into a mortal vessel. The ancient perpetual was instantly set ablaze from the inside out. His veins burned with incandescent psychic fire, illuminating his fragile form with a blinding, ghastly light. His flesh withered and blackened as the boundless pressure of the immaterium sought to violently tear his mind apart. Even his immortal nature was undone by the raging tempest of the broken Webway. He was pinned in place, silently screaming as his very essence was slowly reduced to ash to hold the door against hell itself. For the Master of mankind, it was a moment of profound, chilling grief. He looked upon the burning, agonizing form of his closest confidant, the architect of his vast bureaucracy and his wisest counselor. The Emperor knew that Malcador was dying a true death that would leave no ash behind, facing the absolute annihilation of his immortal soul from the materium and the immaterium alike. This ultimate sacrifice brought humanity no grand victory. It brought only time. The Sigillite was burning his immortal life away simply to grant the Emperor a handful of hours. The stakes were absolute, measured in the fleeting heartbeats of a dying friend whose agony anchored reality itself. Freed from the machinery of the throne, but burdened by a sorrow that could crack planets, the Emperor turned his back on the pyre of the Sigillite. The path to vengeance was finally clear. He gathered his golden armor and drew his flaming sword, casting his psychic gaze upward through the tortured atmosphere of Terra. He fixed his furious will upon the silent leviathan of the vengeful spirit, ready to walk into the darkness and bring an end to the nightmare. The golden flash of the teleportation matrix shattered not against adamantium decking, but against the screaming warp. The Emperor and his chosen had cast themselves from the fortified sanctuary of Terra directly into the maw of the vengeful spirit. Yet the ruinous powers were waiting for this desperate gambit. As the assault force transitioned through the immaterium, the malicious will of the Chaos Gods violently intervened. The cohesive light of the Imperial teleport beam was fractured into scattered sparks. Rogel Dawn, the Golden Custodes, and the sovereign lords of the legions Astartes were hurled into the dark, violently separated from their liege. The War Master had not merely lowered his void shields to invite a duel. He had opened the jaws of a trap forged by 4 unholy deities. The vengeful spirit was no longer a vessel of human engineering. It had been transfigured into a fleshy, non-Euclidean nightmare. Bulkheads wept tears of coagulated blood, and corridors twisted back upon themselves in geometries that defied mortal sanity. The hum of the plasma drives was replaced by the slow, wet heartbeat of a leviathan breathing in the dark. Walls made of fused bone and screaming faces shifted constantly, trapping the boarding parties in isolated pockets of localized hell. In this labyrinth of madness, the master of mankind found himself entirely alone. For the first time since the dawn of his great crusade, the Emperor walked in absolute solitary silence. The psychological torment of the corrupted flagship immediately clawed at his mind. Phantoms of the past and agonizing visions of a ruined future danced within the suffocating gloom. Every step he took through the bleeding corridors forced him to confront the agonizing truth of his favored son. The dark presence saturating the ship revealed the full, horrific extent of the War Master's fall. Horus was no longer the proud conqueror who had once stood at his side. He had been completely hollowed out, his soul consumed and replaced by the concentrated malice of the Pantheon. The Emperor walked through a monument to his own monumental failure, forced to endure the mocking whispers of the warp as he sought the bridge. Somewhere within this twisted architecture of bone and brass, Rogel Dawn carved a bloody path through endless hordes of the damned. Yet the Praetorian was lost in the belly of the beast, trapped far from the heart of the conflict. It was the great angel who found his path unobstructed, driven forward by the cruel hand of fate. Sanguinius, his magnificent wings battered and his armor stained with the slaughter of the Eternity Gate, carved a relentless path through the suffocating, shifting nightmare. He was propelled by the grim certainty of his own prophetic visions, racing desperately to find his fallen brother. Deep within the cavernous darkness of his ascendant sanctum, Horus Lupercal waited with a bloated, unnatural patience. The arch-traitor sat upon a throne of shadows, feeling the pulse of the great vessel as the winged Primarch drew ever closer to the blade that would extinguish his light. The heavy tread of golden boots finally ceased upon the command deck of the vengeful spirit. The air here was a suffocating miasma of malice, saturated with the foul stench of the immaterium. At the center of the vast, shadowed chamber stood the arch-traitor. Horus Lupercal was no longer a Primarch, nor was he even remotely human. He had become a swollen, blistering vessel of the Pantheon, radiating the abyssal hatred of the 4 Chaos Gods. Yet the eyes of the Emperor did not immediately find the face of his fallen son. Instead, his gaze was drawn downward to the shattered gold and ruined white feathers strewn across the dark, corrupted iron. Sanguinius, the great angel, lay dead. His impossibly beautiful form was mangled and broken, his lifeblood pooling out as a final tragic offering at the feet of the War Master. In the exact moment the angel perished, a psychic cataclysm of unimaginable proportions was born. The death of Sanguinius was not a mere physical ending, but a metaphysical shattering of the universe itself. His dying agony tore a bleeding wound into the very fabric of the warp. It was a psychic scream of such profound betrayal and sorrow that it shattered the strict bounds of linear time. The black rage ignited in that singular, horrific second. It was a shockwave that rippled forward into the darkest nightmares of the millennia to come, permanently scarring the genetic lineage of his sons. Every son of Baal, in every era that followed, would forever hear that dying scream. They were condemned by blood and soul to relive the blinding fury and bottomless despair of their father's final defiant stand. The master of mankind looked upon the ruin of his most beloved creation. He then raised his eyes to meet the sneering, ruinous mockery that wore the face of his favored son. In that abyssal silence, the emperor realized the true, devastating magnitude of his own folly. He had navigated the horrors of this flagship, hoping against all reason to save his son. He had fought through the madness while desperately holding on to the remnants of his own humanity. He had restrained his limitless might out of a lingering, desperate fatherly love. That restraint had brought nothing but the death of his brightest angel. Horus was truly gone. The War Master was utterly consumed by the primordial annihilator, reduced to a hollow conduit for the ruinous powers. In the shadow of a murdered angel, the Emperor understood what must be done. To stand against a being saturated with the combined absolute might of the four dark gods, human limitations were no longer sufficient. Restraint was a luxury the dying galaxy could not afford. The Emperor made a terrifying, irrevocable choice. He reached out with his peerless mind and tore down the psychic barriers he had spent countless millennia carefully maintaining. He abandoned his mortal tethers and opened his soul entirely to the raw, unfiltered fury of the warp. The human father died in that agonizing moment, buried beneath a surging tidal wave of absolute power. The decision is made and the ancient limits are shattered. He opens the floodgates of his own soul, unhinging the psychic dams that have restrained his might for countless millennia. To match the bloated vessel of chaos that stands before him, the master of mankind does the unthinkable. He drinks the raw, unadulterated madness of the immaterium. He pulls the raging tempest of the warp into himself, gorging on the infinite poisonous power of the ether. The mortal shell that has walked among humanity for 30,000 years begins to burn away in an instant. He is shedding the guise of a man, casting off the fragile limitations of flesh and blood. In his place stands a Terra of blinding, annihilating light. This light does not illuminate or warm the faithful. It obliterates everything it touches. Time itself grinds to a stagnant halt around him, frozen by the sheer magnitude of his manifestation. Space bends and screams, violently warped by a gravitational mass of absolute psychic supremacy. He is no longer merely fighting the War Master with a blade of forged steel and woven fire. His mere presence is unmaking reality, stripping away the foundational fabric of the material universe atom by agonizing atom. To look upon him is to look upon the inevitable end of all things. The few silent observers trapped within the geometry of that nightmare realm shrink back in absolute, sanity-shattering horror. This is not the benevolent Godmaker who sought to shepherd his species into the safety of the Imperial Webway. There is no salvation in this terrible radiance. This is a desperate, uncontrolled ascension born of unfathomable grief and unforgiving necessity. He is drawing upon the very annihilation he sought to defeat, weaponizing the madness of the Empyrean against its own champions. In order to slay the ultimate monster, the Emperor has chosen to become something infinitely worse. Even Horus, swollen with the infinite malice and gifts of the Pantheon, falters before this blinding apotheosis. The arch-traitor realizes, in a moment of sudden, chilling clarity, that he has not simply provoked a grieving father or an ailing monarch. He has awakened a supreme, cosmic destroyer. The humanity of the Emperor is completely gone, consumed in the furnace of his own desperate wrath. It is replaced by a cold, merciless radiance that promises only eternal silence. The cosmic scales tip violently as the master of mankind gathers the immensity of the warp into a burning crown of absolute ruin. He is becoming a god of the abyss, fueled by the agonizing sacrifice of his own compassion and restraint. The tragic ascension accelerates, tearing through the fundamental laws of existence. The barrier between the materium and the warp dissolves completely under the weight of his transformation. What rises from the ashes of his mortal form is an entity of such devastating magnitude that the stars themselves begin to dim in its shadow. To drink of the infinite is to invite the absolute. In the churning madness of the Empyrean, the birth of a chaos god is not a matter of mere chance or dark sorcery. It is a terrifying inevitability of critical psychic mass. When the emotional resonance and spiritual weight of a species reaches a tipping point, the warp coalesces, and a new deity is violently torn into existence. This is the immutable law of the great ocean. By drawing the boundless, uncontrolled power of the warp into his physical vessel, the master of mankind had triggered this catastrophic metaphysical threshold. He was no longer merely the emperor. He was teetering upon the precipice of dark apotheosis. The boundless energy he had consumed was reshaping his very essence into something monstrous. He was about to become the fifth chaos god. This is the darkest secret of the Horus Heresy, hidden away in the deepest vaults of the Black Library. The entity that was forming within the Emperor was known in whispered prophecy as the Dark King. He was to be the god of encroaching ruin, the sovereign of absolute domination and unending ruination. In this horrifying truth, the true scale of the Pantheon's grand design is laid bare. Horus Lupercal, the War Master, the favoured son, was nothing but a distraction. He was a sacrificial pawn moved across the galactic board to force the Emperor's hand. The four ruinous powers did not simply want to kill the master of mankind, they wanted to welcome their new brother. They engineered a conflict so apocalyptic, so utterly desperate, that the Emperor would have no choice but to weaponize the raw stuff of chaos against it. By taking that power, the Emperor sealed the doom of his own species. The ascension of the Dark King would not save the Imperium. The birth screams of this new god would rip a hole in reality, consuming Terra and swallowing the entirety of the human race. It would be a cataclysm identical to the one that shattered the Eldari Empire when Slanesh was born. Humanity would be annihilated in an instant, its souls devoured to feed the majesty of the encroaching ruin. Behold the ultimate, cruelest irony of the grim darkness of the far future. The ultimate savior of humanity was about to become its ultimate destroyer. In his desperate bid to preserve his dream, the Emperor had transformed into the very nightmare he swore to defeat. The metaphysical weight of his impending ascension was already tearing the fabric of the Immaterium apart. The Pantheon watched with hungry, joyous anticipation as the golden light of the Emperor darkened into an abyssal, crushing gravity. The throne of the Dark King was prepared, and the Emperor was taking his seat. Godhood was only a heartbeat away, and with it, the extinction of mankind. Yet the thread of fate is a fragile thing, easily severed by the smallest blade. In this hour of cosmic despair, the destiny of the galaxy would not be decided by gods, but by the desperate courage of a single mortal man. In the suffocating gloom of the vengeful spirit, a terror far greater than the arch-traitor was taking form. The master of mankind stood upon the very precipice of a terrifying apotheosis. He had drawn so deeply of the Empyrean that he was no longer merely a man, nor even just an emperor. He was swelling into the Dark King, a nascent god of absolute ruin, born from the desperate need to save his realm. To defeat Horus, he had gathered a mantle of supreme cosmic power that threatened to shatter the material universe. Yet within this blinding storm of unchained warp energy, a lone figure stepped directly into the path of oblivion. It was Ullanor's person, the perpetual, a humble soldier, and the oldest friend of the warlord who would become a god. Ullanor did not raise his weapon against the corrupted war master, but turned instead to face the blinding, terrible light of his liege. Through the roaring gale of raw immaterium, the mortal man screamed his desperate plea. He reminded the Emperor of the fragile, flawed humanity he had sworn across the millennia to protect. Ullanor spoke a harsh truth that pierced the deafening madness of divine ascension. He warned that to claim this infinite power was to become the ultimate evil they had sacrificed everything to destroy. If the Emperor embraced the mantle of the Dark King, humanity would survive only as hollowed slaves to a new thirsting god in the pantheon of chaos. The species would be saved from the rebellion of Horus, but its collective soul would be incinerated forever in the fires of a golden tyranny. In that suspended heartbeat of eternity, the master of mankind looked down upon the fragile mortal, standing defiantly against the tide of madness. He saw the unvarnished truth reflected in the weary eyes of an old comrade. He witnessed the monstrous reality of his own impending godhood and the damnation it would bring upon the galaxy. With a supreme, agonizing exertion of sheer willpower, the Emperor made his ultimate choice. He violently severed his connection to the limitless, churning well of the warp. He tore the crown of the Dark King from his own spirit and cast the gathered oceans of empiric might back into the howling void. The psychic backlash of this monumental rejection tore through his physical form with unimaginable agony. He forced himself to shrink back down from the overwhelming scale of a deity into the vulnerable, aching shell of a mortal man. It was a sacrifice of unfathomable proportions. By willingly throwing away the supreme power that could have unmade the War Master with a single thought, the Emperor embraced his own doom. He accepted that he must fight his favored fallen son not as a triumphant god, but as a bleeding, broken father. He deliberately chose the spiritual survival of humanity over his own guaranteed victory. The blinding corona of divine majesty faded into the shadows, leaving only the grim reality of a ruined flagship and a monstrous foe. Stripped of his borrowed omnipotence, the Emperor now faced the full, unbridled malice of the four ruinous powers channeled through the vessel of Horus. The sanctuary of supreme power was gone, replaced only by the cold certainty of mortal flesh stepping forward to bleed. Stripped of the boundless, churning power of the immaterium, the master of mankind faced his favored son not as a god, but as a mortal man. The clash that followed shook the very foundations of the vengeful spirit. Horus, bloated with the limitless sorcery of the pantheon, struck with the fury of four dark deities. The Emperor met him with nothing but cold steel and mortal defiance. Every parry shattered another piece of the Emperor's golden panoply. Every blow he absorbed cracked the bones of the greatest human to ever walk the stars. The War Master was a terrifying avatar of ruin, a vessel of infinite malice that tore into his father with agonizing cruelty. Talon and mace found their mark again and again. Horus struck a ruinous blow that severed the Emperor's arm, tearing it violently from its socket in a shower of shattered auramite and divine vitae. The War Master did not stop, his monstrous claw gouging out the Emperor's eye and crushing his noble visage. With a final, sickening strike, the Worldbreaker mace crashed down, shattering the Emperor's spine. The master of mankind fell to the deck, a broken and dying husk. His divine flesh was ruined, his mortal shell reduced to shattered bone and torn organs. Yet as Horus stood over his creator, gloating with the collective voices of the ruinous powers, the Emperor saw the truth. There was nothing left of his beloved son. Horus was merely a hollow puppet, dancing on the strings of malevolent gods. In that moment of perfect, devastating clarity, the Emperor gathered the absolute last dregs of his own innate psychic might. This was no borrowed immaterium storm, but the pure, distilled essence of his own soul. He forged this desperate power into a lance of blinding, absolute light, channeling it through the crude, flint-chipped athame abandoned by his fallen friend. The Emperor thrust this ancient blade directly into the War Master. The blow did not merely kill the flesh, it eradicated the soul of Horus Lupercal entirely. The Emperor burned his son out of existence across every layer of reality, ensuring that the dark gods could never resurrect their champion. The ruinous powers howled in sudden, agonizing defeat as their greatest weapon was reduced to ash. Silence finally claimed the ruined command deck. The great battle was won, but the cost was the death of the Imperial dream. It was in this graveyard of hope that the Praetorian arrived. Rogel Dawn stormed the bridge, only to fall to his knees in suffocating grief. The stoic lord of the Imperial fists, his legendary composure finally broken, let out a raw, wordless cry of anguish as he gathered the shattered, bleeding remnants of his father into his arms. The Emperor was barely clinging to the edge of life, every breath a bubbling gasp of blood. Through the haze of unimaginable agony, the Master of Mankind forced his final, coherent words into the mind of his grieving son. He commanded Dawn to carry him back to the surface of Terra. He ordered that his broken body be interred upon the ancient machinery of the Golden Throne. The broken flesh of the Master of Mankind was borne down from the bleeding heavens to the ruined sanctums of the Imperial Palace in a procession of unimaginable sorrow. To preserve the fading embers of his divine life, the greatest technomagi of Mars committed acts of desperate, unfathomable tech heresy. They tore into the arcane circuitry of the Golden Throne. Once this marvel of ancient science was designed as a delicate chrysalis, a cradle meant to shepherd humanity into a glorious psychic ascension. It was to be the key to the Webway and the salvation of the species. Now, the Mechanicum stripped away its enlightened purpose. With frantic, trembling hands, they hammered the miraculous into the monstrous. They forged a brutal, vampiric life support engine driven by arcane cybernetics and dark, forgotten sciences. Into this monstrous sarcophagus, the shattered physical vessel of the Emperor was wired and bound. Cold cabling was driven deep into his failing biology, fusing decaying flesh with unyielding iron. He was entombed alive within a prison of his own creation. The Golden Throne roared to life, no longer a conduit for liberation, but an altar of eternal sacrifice. The Master of Mankind awoke to a nightmare from which he could never wake. He is paralyzed, stripped of voice and movement, left to rot upon a seat of absolute agony. Every waking second is a symphony of torment as the machinery drains his essence to keep his cells from final death. Yet the physical torture pales before the cosmic burden placed upon his fractured mind. From within his metal confinement, the Emperor must wage a war on three endless fronts. He must hold the shattered Webway gate shut by the sheer, terrifying force of his will, forever barricading Terra against the infinite tides of the warp. Simultaneously, he must cast his psychic might across the void to direct the Astronomicon, the guiding beacon that keeps the million worlds of his realm tethered together. And in the darkness of the Immaterium, he must forever battle the constant, tearing claws of the Chaos gods who seek to devour his soul. There is no respite, no victory, and no end. The great dream of human ascension was completely denied. In its place, the Emperor achieved only eternal crucifixion. He is the rotting prisoner of the throne, a silent god trapped in a decaying corpse, screaming psychically into a void that cannot answer. The architect of the future was reduced to a battery for a dying present. As the colossal brass doors of the throne room slammed shut, they sealed away the last light of reason in the galaxy. The Imperium was left rudderless in a dark and hostile universe, terrified by the sudden silence of their creator. Without his guiding hand or his speaking voice, humanity was cast adrift into an age of cold despair. With the Master of Mankind silenced upon the Golden Throne, the light of reason was extinguished forever. The imperial truth, the secular dream for which countless loyal heroes had bled, withered in the cold void of his tragic absence. In its place crept a suffocating shadow of sheer desperation. Humanity, bruised and battered by the endless nightmare of the galactic civil war, could no longer bear the cold indifference of an atheistic universe. They desperately needed a savior. They begged for a god. From the apocalyptic ashes of the heresy rose the sprawling priesthood of the Adeptus Ministorum, the organization that would soon solidify into the tyrannical ecclesiarchy. They offered the terrified masses salvation through blind, unthinking devotion. They eagerly burned the scholars, silenced the ancient philosophers, and erected massive cathedral worlds upon the crushed ruins of enlightenment. Yet at the black heart of this galactic church lies a sickening cosmic irony that the high priests dare not utter. The foundational scripture of the entire imperial cult, the sacred text that billions weep over and gladly die for every single day, is the Lectitio Divinitatus. It is the ultimate, inescapable blasphemy cloaked in holy righteousness. For this revered tome was penned not by a loyal saint of the throne, but by Lorgar Aurelian. It is the meticulous work of the Urizen, the first heretic, the very architect of the Horus Heresy itself. The traitor Primarch who plunged the galaxy into an era of endless war ultimately won his twisted philosophical crusade. The Emperor of Mankind, who utterly destroyed Lorgar's perfect city of Monarchia to categorically deny his own divinity, is now worshipped by the precise methods Lorgar invented. The imperiled masses do not realize they pray through the foul words of the damned. This colossal ignorance has bred a terrible, unforeseen consequence within the churning depths of the warp. In the treacherous realm of souls, raw emotion and mass belief hold the terrifying power to reshape reality itself. For 10,000 agonizing years, the fervent, desperate prayers of trillions of human beings have poured directly into the immaterium. Every hymnal chanted in the lightless underhives, every desperate plea shrieked on blood-soaked battlefields, and every dying breath offered in his holy name coalesces like an ocean of raging psychic fire. This staggering, unimaginable weight of collective belief is forcing a horrifying metamorphosis upon the master of mankind. He is actively being remade by the collective madness of his own species. The unyielding psychic pressure of quadrillions of suffering souls is forcing a new kind of ascension upon him, slowly forging a warp entity of terrifying, absolute order. They are feeding him with blind faith, fueling the exact repulsive godhood he fought and bled to reject during his final fateful duel aboard the Vengeful Spirit. He is permanently trapped within a suffocating cage of their adoration, a silent prisoner of their fanaticism. He watches helplessly from his rotting seat of power as his beautiful golden dream twists into a divine, inescapable nightmare. But this immense spiritual apotheosis demands far more than mere prayers to endure the ravenous dark of the void. The grim altar of this newborn god requires a relentless physical communion of flesh and blood, an endless tithe of human agony to keep the psychic beacon of humanity burning. Faith is not merely a spiritual currency within the Imperium of man. It demands a physical toll extracted in blood and burned away in the fires of psychic agony. To sustain the dying master of mankind upon his golden throne, the galaxy itself must be bled. Through the suffocating void sail, the silent vessels of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica's Black Fleet. They are dread leviathans that fall upon a million worlds to harvest the mutant and the cursed. Within their lightless holds, they carry the nascent psyches of humanity. These are men, women, and children burdened with the spark of the immaterium. They are gathered not to be saved, but to be consumed. The master of mankind once dreamed of shepherding humanity through its perilous psychic evolution. He sought to protect his subjects from the maddening predations of the warp. That grand design has been utterly inverted by the cruel march of 10 millennia. The Godmaker machine, originally designed to master the Webway and free humanity from the warp, has become a monstrous soul furnace. The Emperor's children are no longer shielded. Instead, they are the very wood chopped to keep the fires of the Imperium burning. They are cattle driven into the grinding gears of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. Every single day, 1,000 psychers are marched into the subterranean vaults of the Imperial Palace. They are wired into the arcane, humming architecture of the Golden Throne. There is no glory in their duty. There is only a terror that defies mortal comprehension. As the monstrous machinery activates, their life force is violently extracted. Their souls are burned to cinders to sustain the dying physical vessel of the master of mankind. While a completely separate choir of 10,000 psychers is slowly consumed to project the guiding light of the Astronomicon. This is a grim, ritualistic psychic cannibalism enacted on an unfathomable galactic scale. Their minds are flayed apart by the sheer magnitude of the Emperor's ravenous presence. They are reduced to hollow husks before crumbling to ash upon the floor of the throne room. This daily atrocity is the sole tether keeping the Emperor's fractured soul bound to his rotting corpse. Without this constant feast of screaming souls, the beacon would fail, and the ships of humanity would be lost in the dark. Without the sacrifice, the Imperium would be shattered by the warp in a matter of days. For 10,000 years, this relentless engine of death has never ceased its grinding hunger. To endure 10,000 years of unremitting agony, a soul must be stripped of its softer facets. When the master of mankind stepped aboard the vengeful spirit to confront his traitorous son, he made a terrible sacrifice. To muster the will necessary to obliterate Horus, the Emperor had to excise his own mercy. He cast away his compassion, his paternal love, and his hope. Those noble virtues were torn from his spirit and discarded into the ether. Yet within the infinite tides of the Empyrean, such profound resonance does not simply vanish. Radical factions within the Inquisition, hunted as heretics by their own peers, whisper of a miraculous coalescence. They call it the Star Child. According to this forbidden doctrine, the rejected fragments of the Emperor's humanity gathered in the deep warp. Untainted by the corruption of the ruinous powers, this pure essence formed a dormant, benevolent entity. It is a nascent god of salvation, shining like a lonely candle in a howling abyss. The implications of this theory are as terrifying as they are profound. If the Emperor's compassion and love reside within the Star Child, then we must ask what exactly sits upon the golden throne. The answer is a chilling testament to sheer endurance. The entity shackled to Terra is completely devoid of humanity. It is an engine of cold logic, unfathomable psychic rage, and relentless, agonizing duty. It is a hollowed-out tyrant of the mind, sustaining the Imperium not out of love for mankind, but through the mechanical necessity of survival. Those few who harbor the knowledge of the Star Child, esoteric sects such as the Illuminati, believe this dichotomy is the key to our ultimate salvation. They scour the galaxy for the sensei, individuals believed by radical fringes to be the true biological descendants of the Emperor, seeking to harness their unique essence to awaken the sleeping god. But the birth of a warp entity requires a cataclysm of unimaginable proportions. For the Star Child to fully awaken and manifest as a god of order and light, its mortal tether must be severed. The Emperor must be allowed to physically die, the Golden Throne must fail. Terra itself must be consumed in the resulting psychic detonation, sacrificing trillions of souls to crack the shell of the material universe. Only then can the Star Child be born to scour the warp clean. It is a desperate, apocalyptic gamble that promises an eternity of peace at the cost of the entire throne world. Yet, there are whispers that even this radical hope is horribly naive. There are scholars who gaze into the shifting madness of the immaterium and see a very different future awaiting the physical death of the master of mankind. They foresee an ascension not of benevolent salvation, but of absolute consuming terror. But to harbor hope for a benevolent savior is to fundamentally misunderstand the nature of divinity in the grim darkness of the far future. The concept of a gentle star child is a comforting lie whispered by those who cannot face the true consequence of apotheosis. If the master of mankind were to fully shed his mortal coil and ascend, the resulting entity would not be a kind father returning to heal his broken children. He would be a god of order. And in this galaxy, order is not synonymous with righteousness or peace. Order is stasis. Order is the absolute crushing tyranny of unyielding compliance. To be a god of order is to demand the perfect, motionless synchronization of the cosmos. It is the ultimate eradication of variance, of choice, and of the chaotic spark that defines the mortal soul. An awakened emperor, unchained from his rotting physical form, would not lead us into a golden age of enlightened freedom. He would exact a terrible perfection upon the galaxy, wielding his immense psychic might as a weapon of absolute subjugation. His blinding illumination would scour away all shadows, but in doing so, It would scorch the very humanity from those he once sought to protect. Imagine the terrifying reality of his ultimate success. The human species would no longer be a sprawling, vibrant tapestry of striving individuals. We would become a boundless choir of hollowed golden thralls, stripped of will and forever locked in static servitude. Every individual mind would be violently subsumed into his incandescent brilliance. Our memories, our desires, and our distinct identities would be burned away to feed the singular monolithic will of the anathema. There would be no art, no dissent, no grief, and no joy. There would only be the suffocating radiance of total, unbreakable submission. To be absorbed into this divine light is to experience a death of the self just as horrific as being dragged into the warp. The ruinous powers twist the flesh and fracture the mind with unending, capricious malice. Their realm is a maelstrom of madness and agonizing mutation. But the alternative offered by a fully realized God of Order is simply the opposite extreme of the same cosmic nightmare. Instead of being torn apart by a million laughing demons, humanity would be frozen forever in a state of crystalline subjugation. It is a prison forged of searing gold rather than rotting meat, yet it remains an eternal prison all the same. A tyrannical god of stasis offers no salvation, only a sanitized and silent apocalypse. This chilling vision of ultimate control was once merely a philosophical terror debated by the most radical inquisitors in the deepest shielded vaults of the Ordo Hereticus. It was a theoretical nightmare, held at bay only by the Emperor's lingering humanity and his agonizing, unending imprisonment upon the Golden Throne. Yet the great wheel of the galaxy is turning toward a dark reckoning. The delicate balance that has kept this golden tyranny from manifesting is beginning to fracture under the weight of catastrophic galactic shifts. The signs of this terrifying metamorphosis are no longer confined to the ancient, crumbling parchment of forgotten prophecies. The 13th Black Crusade broke the gate of Cardia and split the galaxy in twain. The Great Rift, known to the faithful as the Cicatrix Maledicta, tore across the firmament in a cataclysm of raw nightmare. Where once the veil between real space and the immaterium held firm, now a bleeding wound of pure chaos spills across the stars. Yet this ultimate triumph of the dark gods carried within it the seeds of their own terror. The unfettered flood of warp energy did not merely drown worlds in madness. It washed over the Golden Throne and supercharged the ancient, withered husk of the master of mankind. The God of Order is no longer merely stirring in his slumber. He is awake, and his wrath is terrible to behold. For 10,000 years, the Emperor was a passive shield, holding the door shut against the horrors of the dark. Now, the door is open, and he is reaching through. Across the imperiled Imperium, golden miracles manifest with a frequency and violent intensity unseen since the days of the Great Crusade. Living saints erupt into existence, burning with a celestial fire that incinerates the demonic. The spectral dead of the Legion of the Damned march in lockstep from the ether, their phantom bolters tearing through the enemies of humanity. The Emperor is no longer fighting a war of mere defense. He has struck directly into the very heart of the ruinous powers. Through the psychic resonance of his faithful, the Emperor reached into the pestilential depths of the plague god's domain. He unleashed a purgatorial conflagration of golden fire that scorched Nurgle's garden and sent the primordial pantheon recoiling in profound wariness. The Chaos Gods now realize that by cracking the galaxy open, they have given the anathema the power to strike back. Yet this newfound majesty is a tragedy of cosmic proportions. The Emperor of mankind, the ultimate rationalist who burned the last churches of Terra, despised the very concept of divinity. He rejected godhood with every breath of his mortal life. Now that mortal life is irrelevant. The unceasing devotion of countless trillions of human souls, screamed into the void daily, has combined with the raw, reality-warping hemorrhage of the Great Rift. This tidal wave of faith and etheric power is overriding his ancient decrees. The Emperor is undergoing an accelerated apotheosis against his own will. He is being forged into a cruel, unyielding deity of absolute order, imprisoned within a cage of desperate worship. The sheer magnitude of this divine transformation is incomprehensible to the mortal mind, a terrifying dawn of psychic supremacy. Only a being of his own blood, resurrected into this nightmare era, could possibly comprehend the horrifying scale of what his father has become. When the avenging son stepped into the throne room of Terra, he sought the wisdom of a father. He found only the blinding, suffocating radiance of a dying star. Primarch Guilliman had endured 10 millennia of stasis, clinging to the memory of the master of mankind as a peerless intellect and a guiding light. What waited for him upon the golden throne was a horror beyond the comprehension of mortal minds. The air within the sanctum was heavy with the stench of ozone, roasted flesh, and the crushing weight of raw, unfiltered psychic dominion. There was no gentle greeting. There was no welcoming embrace from a creator to his final loyal offspring. Instead, the Primarch was struck by a psychic gale force that stripped away all illusion. The Emperor did not speak with a single unified voice. His consciousness had been shattered into 10,000 conflicting shards by millennia of endless agony and the bloated worship of untold trillions of souls. Guilliman heard a choir of madness echoing within his own skull. Some voices screamed in eternal torment, burning upon the psychic pyre of the throne. Others roared with the cold, Xenos logic of an uncaring cosmos, calculating the expenditure of lives in the billions. Still others commanded absolute, unthinking obedience with the crushing authority of an unyielding tyrant. It was a cacophony of fractured godhood. Beneath the sheer psychic pressure, Guilliman fell to his knees. In that terrible communion, he looked into the mind of his creator and saw his own reflection. The Emperor did not look upon him with the pride of a father. There was no warmth, no sorrow for the tragedies that had befallen the Imperium, and no pity for the son who had returned to a nightmare. The Emperor looked upon Guilliman as a craftsman might look upon a perfectly forged tool, discovered abandoned in a dusty, forgotten shed. The avenging son was merely a weapon to be picked up, sharpened and wielded against the encroaching dark. The realization struck Guilliman with a profound and crushing despair. The lie of his upbringing was finally laid bare. They had never been sons to the master of mankind. They were instruments of war, engineered for a specific purpose and kept until they were no longer needed. The man Primarch Guilliman once knew, the visionary who walked among mortals and laughed with his generals, was completely and utterly gone. Humanity had been burned away by 10,000 years of suffering and the desperate need to keep the warp at bay. In the husk of the Emperor, there remained no empathy, no mortal virtue, and no salvation. Only the weapon, the ravenous dying star, and the terrifying birth pangs of a nascent god remained. Guilliman rose from the foot of the golden throne utterly alone in a universe that had gone mad. He carried the crushing burden of a truth too horrifying to share with the crumbling empire he was now forced to lead. We look upon the rotting carcass of the Imperium and weep for what was lost. The master of mankind did not stumble blindly into the dark. He sought to engineer his own apotheosis within the hidden labyrinth of the Webway. It was a calculated ascension designed to shepherd humanity away from the predations of the warp. That grand design was shattered in a single moment of arrogant folly by the Crimson King Magnus. The desperate hubris of the Cyclops broke the arcane wards and flooded the future with the shrieking tides of the Immaterium. From that ruin was born a desperation that reshaped the very cosmos. To defeat the arch-traitor, he was forced to drink deeply from the poisoned well of the warp. He gathered unimaginable power to himself until the breaking point was reached. He stood upon the precipice of becoming the Dark King. The birth of a fifth god of chaos would have consumed Terra and swallowed the galaxy in an unending storm of absolute ruin. Knowing the horror of what he was about to become, the Emperor cast that infinite power aside. He rejected the poisoned chalice of dark godhood. Instead, he chose a fate far worse than any mortal death. He bound himself to the unimaginable agony of the Golden Throne, embracing a 10,000-year crucifixion to hold the gates of hell tightly closed. Every moment of his existence since that day has been an eternity of silent screaming. He suffers an unending torment so that humanity might draw another breath in the suffocating dark, and yet we are left to look upon the ruins of his dream and wonder. We must ask if the suffocating nightmare of the 41st millennium is truly our greatest tragedy. The modern Imperium is a decaying behemoth where countless billions are ground to dust in the gears of a merciless war machine. It is a realm of bloody ignorance and blind fear where hope is a long-forgotten myth. But perhaps we must ask ourselves a far more terrifying question. We must consider what the galaxy would look like if the Emperor had succeeded in his grand design. If he had ascended to become a flawless and eternal god of absolute order, we must wonder what would have become of our humanity. A universe bound by absolute order leaves no room for defiance or choice or the chaotic beauty of the human spirit. Such a god would have stripped away every mortal flaw and every spark of human free will to forge a perfect and sterile machine. We are left to ponder the true nature of our bloody survival. We must question whether the destruction of the Imperial dream was the ultimate doom of our species, or perhaps the ruin of the God-Maker project spared us from a fate far worse than the endless war we endure today. Perhaps the only thing that kept our souls from being devoured by an eternity of stagnant perfection was the tragic failure of a father. In the grim darkness of the far future, there are no true saviors. There is only the long and bloody twilight. We bleed upon the altar of mere survival and wonder if the blood we shed is the price of our freedom or the guarantee of our damnation.